thank you for coming out here on a Friday afternoon for our Humanities Center annual symposium. I'm Matt Wickman. I'm the director of the center. This is our fourth year as a Humanities Center, and the fourth year we've done this annual symposium. We do a lot of different things in our Humanities Center. We have several, more than a dozen research groups who are inviting guests. We have weekly colloquy where faculty usually present their work in progress. We meet about important items of interest broadly about the humanities. We have research fellowships. We are kind of a multitasking center. But we have two events every year that are built up around an annual theme. This year's annual theme for the Humanities Center is the work of art with work underlined. And it's about the question of what labor it is that art does in the world. And given that this was our theme, we thought it'd be great to have Caroline Levine from Wisconsin, Madison join us. She very graciously accepted. Caroline Levine is a professor of English and also chair of the English department at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. I had the chance to talk with her a bit this past summer where she was a speaker on a panel at the conference of the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes held in Madison this year, and she gave a great talk there. And if you've read her book, Forms, we discussed this morning as a faculty, you'll know this is a really interesting work that she's doing. Caroline is a Victorianist by training, interested in Victorian literature and culture, and also interested in questions of form, formalism, realism, narrative theory, recently world literature, and consistently in her work, the relations between art and politics. She got her PhD at the University of London, and she was an undergrad at Princeton. And so she's been educated on multiple continents and kind of carries those sensibilities with her in a lot of the work that she does. She's written several books. Her first book, published in 2004, was entitled The Serious Pleasures of Suspense, Victorian Realism and Narrative Doubt. And it won the Perkins Prize from the Narrative Society as the best book of that year on that subject. She then published a book entitled Provoking Democracy, Why We Need the Arts. I guess she could have been the speaker for the symposium in 2007, but we didn't have the Humanities Center, so what's the point? And that came out in 2007 from Blackwell Manifesto series. And most recently, she published this year with Princeton University Press the book Forms, subtitled Whole, Rhythm, Hierarchy, and Network. She's also one of the editors of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. Has edited a volume of essays called Narrative Middles, Navigating the 19th Century, British Novel, and is a very prolific and very generous, not just writer, but thinker. And I think it'll take you all about 2 minutes to ascertain this in the talk that she gives. There's a lot of ground in what she says for productive questioning. And so I hope that you will save these questions in your mind, ask them of her after her talk, and that right now you'll join me in welcoming our speaker, Caroline Levine.
It is really such a pleasure to be here in so many ways. First of all, what a gorgeous campus and such a stimulating set of conversations so far. I really, if this were Madison and it was this beautiful outside, there would be nobody here. But I realize that good weather doesn't come quite as rarely to you, so I don't have to be quite as grateful that you're here. But thank you for coming on a Friday afternoon. I'm particularly happy to have the chance to think about the theme, the work of art. It's a question that's close to my heart in many ways, including thinking about labor and literature quite a lot over the years. I've been teaching a course called Work and Art in the 19th Century for a number of years, where we think about different relationships to this question. One, how does art represent work? And some art forms seem to do it much better than others. But also, should all workers be like artists? Should we all be creative in our work? Which was something that John Ruskin and William Morris argued, and that I have always felt was a wonderful model for work. So I'm just very interested in this question of what the work of art might be. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the trouble that art can have in representing work, and the trouble that literary criticism in particular, but the humanities in general, has in talking about labor. I'm also going to talk about some other repetitive activities like labor, including habit, so just thinking about repetition in general. I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the argument of my recent book, and I know a number of you have read it, so I'm going to try to keep it very short. But I want to use that to set up the problem that I'm going to ask essentially about repetitive patterns, and especially habit and labor. What I argued in my book is that we should understand form as both an aesthetic problem and as a way to understand how power works. Political power, we know, often operates through spatial containers and boundaries, such as nation states and domestic walls. We have constant arguments about who belongs where. Do working class crowds belong in the public square? Do women belong in voting booths? But politics isn't only about imposing order on space. It's also about organizing time. So we might think about prison terms, naturalization periods, and the legal age for voting rights, military service, and sexual consent. We also know that politics means enforcing hierarchies, white and black, masculine and feminine, straight and queer, have and have not. So the political involves activities of ordering, patterning, and shaping. Politics, as I learned from Jacques Rancière, is all about distributions and arrangements, which means that there is no politics without form. So I've been pushing for this expansive notion of form, one that moves beyond the aesthetic to a definition that includes all kinds of shapes and patterns. But it's been very important to me to notice that they don't all shape us in any single or simple way. And I argued in my book that it's productive to focus on what happens when different forms meet and overlap, as many, many shapes and patterns are doing all the time. One of the goals of my argument was to address a kind of critical position in the field that I found unpersuasive for a long time. And this is my engagement with historicism, which has lots of different pieces to it, but I wanted to talk about just one of them right now. That notion that critics have often had in recent years, that literary forms are embedded in particular historical moments and that they respond to particular socio-political worlds. So they might read the plot of detective fiction, for example, as coming out of urbanization and the rise of the surveillance state. It's troubled me that the causality so often goes in one direction, from the social to the aesthetic. And my argument instead is that shapes and arrangements are portable, that they can cross period boundaries, and they can organize both literary and non-literary objects. So to keep with the example of detective fiction for a moment, there are lots of different forms that organize detective fiction. I'm just going to focus on two that we might find in lots of different examples: suspense and racial hierarchy. Both of these, you might notice, predate the invention of detective fiction, and both of them last well beyond that moment of invention. And they also perform their specific kinds of organizing work across contexts, both in different times and places, and also both inside and outside of the literary text. So I spent most of the book I just finished showing how encounters between forms can have unpredictable consequences. And I'll just give you one quick example from the book. I got interested in how one form, the gender binary, the gender hierarchy, masculine and femininity, often crossed paths with another form, which is the boundaries of domestic space. So women are often associated with the home and also literally enclosed within the home. And women are lower in the gender hierarchy. So what happens when a man enters the home? Does his presence raise the value of the home by associating it with masculinity, so pushing it up in the hierarchy? Or does it lower him, his association with this feminine sphere, bringing him down in the hierarchy? So examples I looked at from different times and places suggested to me that the answer was genuinely open. It could go either way. The encounter of forms is in this sense aleatory. But this is what raised some questions for me that have continued to bother me since I finished the book. I never wanted to suggest that we lived in some kind of formal free-for-all where just any form could come along and organize us in some new way. It's clear that some arrangements dominate and are stable. And why is it that some last, whereas others are unsettled by other forms? So why are some forms able to keep imposing their order on experience, while others disappear or change? So it's this question. Oh, sorry, I was going to show you the up and the down. Why do some forms last? That I want to start by asking here today. I'll just introduce this problem here in the first section, and then my talk has two more parts. I'll be thinking about how and why I've been coming to see repetition as crucial to understanding the staying power of some forms. And then I'll be suggesting reasons why literary studies and the humanities more generally has not wanted to dwell on repetition. And then in the third and last section of the talk, I'll look at some ways that 19th century writers took up repetition, specifically habit and labor. And I'll be spending a fair amount of time with the poem about work that I've handed out, John Clare's The Harvest Morning, which I do not expect you to know already. It's not a widely known poem, but we'll work through it together. Okay, so why do some forms last? Now, clearly some forms last because they're made out of robust material substances like rock or steel. So prison walls and city streets and sewers and classrooms, all of these are ways of organizing space and materials that are built to last. But other powerful forms, like race and gender hierarchies, for example, are not so obviously indestructible as stone or steel. But they too last, and way longer than they should. Patterns like patriarchy and slavery have kept imposing their order on social relationships long after they're no longer official institutions. So what I really want to think about is how these kinds of patterns survive over long periods of time. In part, they last because they shape other, more materially inert forms. So I want to look very briefly at the example of redlining, the US government practice of defining certain neighborhoods as too risky for banks to invest in them. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration guaranteed loans only in neighborhoods occupied, quote, by the race for which they are intended, and where local schools should not be attended in large numbers by inharmonious racial groups. This is in our law. This law prompted the building of mostly white neighborhoods in the suburbs. Redlining then shaped other forms, like the construction of mass transit systems and highways that link downtowns to white suburbs, but most often bypass minority neighborhoods. So what we see in this example is that racial hierarchy successfully organizes and regulates other forms. It measures the concentration of black and white bodies in space. It draws boundaries around neighborhoods. It directs the connective routes taken by roads, mass transit, and clean water. And these re-entrench poverty and segregation, which limit upward mobility for African Americans living in the city. So in this story, racism is an intentional ideological force in the first place, but then it organizes other forms. But then those other forms are less intentional in reinforcing racist hierarchy and the cycle of poverty. So the case of redlining, what we have is a kind of formal feedback loop. Forms work together to write racism into the built environment. Still, not all arrangements are literally built into space in this way. So how do forms last that don't take inert material shape like this? What I want to suggest is that repetition is much more important to an understanding of the staying power of both political and aesthetic forms than we've been recognizing recently in the humanities. There are different reasons why repetitive patterns that shape us fall out of the range of our perception. They might be too large or too small, or maybe even too complex for human consciousness, as some post-human theorists have suggested. But what I want to do is to focus on repetitions that we can perceive. The ones that I'm interested in are those that we can perceive but that we routinely ignore because they're just too ordinary, they're too mundane to command our attention. So it's these kinds of repetitions, the most humdrum habits, that I think may be crucial to the staying power of the most oppressive forms. So in the second part of my talk, I'd like to suggest that it's time for a rethinking of repetition in the humanities. and I'm going to talk particularly about literary studies, but there's certain patterns that are true across history and art history too, and I'd be interested to hear if there are philosophers here about whether this is true in philosophy. Now, I am by no means the first thinker to draw attention to repetition. I'm sure many of you in this room have thought to yourselves about repetition in some interesting way at some point. A whole range of post-structuralist theorists helped us to think about iterability and reappropriation, for example. So we might think of Derrida's signature event context, the kind of mimicry that Michael Taussig describes in colonial contexts, and acts of queering that have been theorized most influentially by Judith Butler. But since historicism has become the norm in literary studies and art history, scholars have been much more interested in located specificity, the singularity of experience, rather than repetitive patterns. So you might take Catherine Gallagher and Stephen Greenblatt, for example, who argue that their historicism is not a repeatable methodology, and that for them, the task of understanding depends on an encounter with the singular, the specific, and the individual. I'm just taking them as one example. I think we find this sentiment across lots and lots of historicist work. At the same time, some of the most impressive work that's been done by historicists has, at least implicitly, depended on the tracking of repetitions. The field has been dedicated to revealing the work of powerful norms like racism and heteronormativity in particular times and places. And we know from Butler, among others, that these norms are always citational. They're always repetitive. You can't really have a norm that has only one iteration to it. So if someone said once that women were less rational than men, or if one person claimed that black men were dangerous, these statements wouldn't matter at all politically. What makes them powerful is that they're made again and again, sedimented into common sense, and accompanied by predictable rewards and punishments. Even wealth inequities don't belong to a single original moment of distribution. Class gets maintained through repeatedly uneven distributions. We can think here of laws that sustain lopsided distributions of wealth through generations. So I see a tension between, on the one hand, the field's focus on delimited local contexts, and on the other hand, powerful patterns that work precisely by repeating across time and space. And it's the repetition part of the story that I think has too often dropped off the critical radar. In part because I think this is because we figured power not as repetitive, but as fixed or static. So here, one of the terms that I'm interested in is specificity. The other one that I've been interested in rethinking is structure. And we borrowed the term structure from the social sciences to describe entrenched inequalities like race and gender. But just to think about the term, a structure implies an organized interrelation of parts in a whole, as in a building. And some critics have actually actively cultivated this figure. David Theo Goldberg, who's writing about racial classification in the US, writes that the one-drop rule was taken as the cement in the edifice of social structure. So at the risk of seeming very literal-minded, I want to insist that rules like these are actually not made out of cement in any literal way, and that the state does not work as a single solid structure where all the parts are interrelated. So I think if we too often figure them this way, we run the risk of missing how power actually works through repetition. But it's especially difficult for literary studies as a discipline to value repetition. Traditionally, our job as critics has been precisely to dismiss the routine and the predictable. So you can find the idea that repetition is actively harmful at work across lots of different schools of literary thought. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples that I hope represent an array of different kinds of literary thinkers. I'm going to start with eminent close reader Helen Wendler as one of our examples of people who are against repetition. She writes, "Forgettable writers of verse adopt the generic style of their era and repeat themselves in it." So if you're repetitive, you're going to be forgotten. We won't bother with you as literary critics. A very, very different kind of formalist, the Russian Viktor Shklovsky, also condemned routine, but for very different reasons. He coined the term defamiliarization to name art's power to unsettle our repetitive habits of perception that take the place of genuine and attentive looking or perceiving. So we get too routinized and then we don't see the world anymore. And it's repetition that's the problem. One of the things that worried the Frankfurt School, yet another different kind of school of literary and cultural thought, one of the things that worried the Frankfurt School most about the culture industry was its insistence on standardizing, what they called the constant reproduction of the same. So I want to think about these three just as kind of representatives of different fields, to think about how repetition is emerging as an obstacle to three really very different values in the field. So for Wendler, repetition gets in the way of aesthetic innovation and originality. For Shklovsky and the Frankfurt School, repetitive habits get in the way of radical politics. And then, as I was saying a couple of minutes ago, for historicists like Gallagher and Greenblatt, repetition gets in the way of historical specificity. So I just want to note how these are all values that are very different from each other, but they're all being used to justify work in the field of literary studies, and they're all setting themselves against repetition. So I think we can start to see why it might be really hard for literary studies to keep repetition front and center. An inattention to the mundane is part of the ordinary work that we do. It's the DNA of our field is to ignore the repetitive. Now, recently, digital humanists have been calling this focus on the extraordinary into question. Franco Moretti points out that by reading a few texts closely, as we've done conventionally, we don't even acknowledge the massive scale of the cultural archive. So he refers to the overwhelming number of novels published just in 19th century Britain alone. He says there may have been 50,000 novels published in that one century, in that one nation. So even the most dedicated readers might get to 1% of them, professional readers might get to 1% of those in a lifetime. And that's just novels. Moretti's not interested in any other genre. So think about the hugeness of the archive. So one of Moretti's projects has been to track repetitive patterns across a vast corpus instead of valuing the singular and the distinctive. He and other digital scholars, and here's just one example, have visualized repetitions that you can't grasp by reading in the ordinary conventional way from cover to cover. So here's one example from Tanya Clement's data mining. On the other hand, other critics have really strongly resisted this move. A lot of humanists have argued that massively digested numbers are reductive. They've worried that only some kinds of things, and not necessarily the most important things, can be counted. And some scholars have even argued that big data has deeply destructive effects. So Matt may remember he was at the same conference I was at where we heard historian Khalil Gibran Muhammad in a talk he gave. He argued that data about the incarceration of Black men in the US has actually been counterproductive. So for a reader like me, if I see a graph like this, to me that's showing a disproportionate number of Black men in jail, that's evidence of structural racism. So I see it as pointing to a problem with the legal system. But for others who look at the same graph, it just reinforces an association of criminality with Blackness. So Muhammad was saying, don't just go with the numbers. The numbers actually reduce the information. They don't get at what's really important. And he argued that humanists instead should understand our most important job as the gathering and the telling of specific individual stories. So I want to enter into a long-standing argument about repetition and difference in the humanities, one that I think is continuing into our own time through the digital humanities and historicism in particular. It's my hypothesis that there's been such a valorization and essentialization of difference and singularity in the humanities that we've too often lost track of how crucial iterability and citation are to power and knowledge. So what if we took repetitive patterns as our primary objects of knowledge? In some ways, we have no choice. Even the most traditional reading that has prized originality and innovation has also involved the tracking of repetitions. And I had a bad gotcha passage about Helen Wendler in here that I took out, but she tracks repetitions all the time, right? But she says repetitive writers are not to be paid attention to. But I did want to think about how repetitive patterns happen across acts of reading in literary studies, and I think across the humanities too. So let's just think about different repetitive patterns that we look at and think about in literary studies as a routine matter. First of all, poetic form, we might think about rhythm, which is a recurrent pattern of sound lengths or stresses, and rhyme, the echoing or return of a prior sound. Anaphora, alliteration, and assonance are all sonic repetitions. Now, themes, too, are nothing other than the repetition of an idea or a concept. So if a novel happens to mention marriage once in passing, then that's not one of the novel's themes. But if it keeps coming back to it and keeps working out what a good marriage is and what the right husband is, then you say that marriage is one of the novel's themes. Character, too, maybe surprisingly, depends on repetition. And I'm going to give you a quotation from Seymour Chapman, and I want to disavow responsibility for this quotation. This is on our idea of character. Quote, the claim, John is a loser, projects John has lost many times and will continue to do so. So our notion of character is dependent on repetition. So I wouldn't have said John is a loser. Narrative itself is impossible without repetition. As Wendy Steiner explains, what makes us aware that we're encountering change over time, which is crucial to the temporal unfolding of narrative, is the repetition of a subject. And I want to broaden the frame, too, to say repetition isn't just a problem for formalists. Genre theorists have been really interested in variations, but it's also true that genres are only identifiable as such when certain recognizable elements repeat across multiple examples. And then, as I suggested earlier, for scholars interested in social power, there's been an emphasis on the recurrent patterns that organize our lives, including norms, hierarchies, and stereotypes, all enforced by predictable, repeatable rewards and punishments. And then I mentioned, too, that we can see repetition as crucial to ironic reappropriations, including post-colonial mimicry and acts of queering. So what interests me most here about this list is not that we haven't paid attention to repetition, we certainly have, but that we've both depended on repetition for our analysis and so often continue to see repetition as an obstacle to the things that we most value, which are originality, radical politics, and singularity. So for my new work, I have two guiding hypotheses. First, that repetition is crucial to the staying power of political and economic forms that worry us, trouble us. And second, that literary patterns, by virtue of their repetitions, can help us to think about political and economic ones. But both of these require us in literary studies to rethink our relationship to repetition and to make it more central to what we do. I believe there may be ethical and political benefits to valuing repetition that go beyond this understanding of power that I'm trying to get at. Among other effects, a focus on repetition could help us to revalue ordinary life and labor. After all, as Elaine Scarry writes, what's most likely to characterize working class experience is perpetual, repetitive, habitual labor. Now, Scarry argues in her book, Resisting Repetition, which is a book Resisting Representation, I think it's called. It's a book I really love. She argues that to attract readers, narratives have to steer clear of representing work directly because it's such incredible monotony that it would just bring the reading to a halt. And so art itself has often pushed ordinary life in terms of repetition to the margins of our perception. Now, I'd like to broaden this claim even farther. We know from Derrida and others that there's no outside to repetition. There's no language, there's no culture without repetition. So if we put too much of our own emphasis on interruptions and singularities and subversions, I'm concerned that we won't work together to try to imagine new routines of life and labor, that is, new repetitions for ourselves and each other that would help us to reproduce, say, justice instead of injustice or equality instead of inequality. Now, revaluing repetition could also help us to stop thinking in such oppositional ways about the humanities and the sciences. So right now, if we think about Khalil Gibran Muhammad's point that data reduces and the humanities specify and give us kind of texture, We often fall back on the assumption that humanities are focused on the singular, and that's our value, while the sciences track the generalities of large numbers, and that's one of our basic differences. But given how important repetition has been to literary studies in that list that I showed across acts of reading, I think we're actually better at tracking patterns than we like to admit. So this has become really important to my teaching lately. A lot of my students come to me saying, literary studies is soft and subjective, it's anything you want. The sciences are objective and reliable knowledge. So I've started to ask students to think about how across their different courses in lots of different disciplines, from animal science to economics to literature, we're all coming to knowledge by identifying what repeats and what doesn't, and that we have in common across the university. And this has involved for me in part a move away from, I used to teach close reading as an attempt to get at a kind of wholeness of the text. I don't do that anymore. Now, I teach it as pattern recognition. That is, I ask students to notice and connect different kinds of repetitions, let's say rhyme and theme, across a text. And then I ask them to connect this method to their other classes, like biology or economics. And I've been asking them whether they see affinities between their work in one class and their work in another. And my favorite moment was when a math major told me that he switched on his math brain to think about the double structure of North and South. And he had pointed out an amazing feature of this novel that I had never seen before, but he said it was his math brain that he turned on to do it. So pattern recognition has been emerging for me as a way of teaching connections between STEM and non-STEM fields and helping students to think about the mission and work of the university more generally. And this brings me to the third part of my talk. So while I want to notice these commonalities across disciplines, I don't actually just think that they're all the same exactly. And I also think that literary studies has something special to offer to problems of repetition and social power. So in part, what I want to think about in this next section is how literary texts theorize the repetitions of labor, politics, and economics through their own repetitive patterns. And this means that instead of dwelling on the moments when literary texts interrupt or innovate, when they experiment and produce a new generic form that's so exciting to us, I'm proposing to pay a much more sustained and self-conscious attention to how and why and when literary texts think through repetition. Now, more than any other writers, it's 19th century novelists and poets who, in very different ways, have jolted me to think about repetition in new ways. So I'd like to look at a few examples of texts that analyze habit and valorize labor. I want to think with you about ways that writers are inventing strategies to represent ordinariness without just falling into utter monotony, which I think Scary is right to worry about. So I hope these will help to show how complex and valuable it could be to put repetition front and center. My first examples come from the realist novel. Russian formalists like Shklovsky argued that we have these deadening habits of perceiving the world, and that art works best when it startles us out of these habits. I want to suggest that realist novelists saw the problem of habit as more complicated than that. For these writers, the most important goal was to interrupt habits. Yes, I think they would have agreed with Shklovsky there. But the habit that they worried most about was our habit of being too interested in exceptional and extraordinary experience. So what's really important about our world, according to these novelists, is that it's not exciting or exceptional. It's actually mostly repeating itself. So it's not just that we have dulled habits of perception, which is Shklovsky's point, but that these routines include a failure to recognize that our world is itself made up of routines. One of the central challenges of realism, I'm hypothesizing, is that we have a habit of ignoring habit. So let me give you an example from Bleak House, Charles Dickens' Bleak House. Joe, the crossing sweeper, is dying in part from poverty and neglect. And in this famous passage, the narrator reflects both on how ordinary this tragedy is and on how its very ordinariness contributes to Joe's fate. He is not one of Mrs. Pardiggle's Takahupo Indians. He is not one of Mrs. Jellybee's lambs, being wholly unconnected with Borriabula Ga. He is not softened by distance and unfamiliarity. He is not a genuine foreign-grown savage. He's the ordinary, homemade article. Dirty, ugly, disagreeable to all the senses, embody a common creature of the common streets, only in soul a heathen. Homely filth begrimes him, homely parasites devour him, homely sores are in him, homely rags are on him. Native ignorance, the growth of English soil and climate, sinks his immortal soul, immortal nature lower than the beasts that perish. Stand forth, Joe, in uncompromising colors, from the sole of thy foot to the crown of thy head. There is nothing interesting about thee. So what we have here is a kind of vicious cycle of inattentiveness. We readers ignore poor children like Joe because they're too familiar. They're not exotic enough. They're not fancy foreign savages. So we don't take any interest in them. But the commonness of Joe's fate is, in fact, precisely what should be most shocking to us. We're in the habit of noticing only the exceptional. So the crucial challenge for Dickens here is not just to make the ordinary feel shocking, but to make the fact that it feels ordinary feel shocking. So you might notice that what Dickens does in part is to repeat the words common, common, homely, 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 as if he's introducing a new routine. So in order to get us to think repetition, he's actually repeating words in a way that's much more ritualistic than narrative prose often is. So he keeps repeating the language of ordinariness instead of allowing us to fall back into our too ordinary attraction to what is not ordinary. So defamiliarization in the realist novel is a kind of meta problem. It's not just about freshening perception, it's about freshening perception of what is not fresh, deadening repetition. Now we find a very similar logic in Middlemarch, in the scene where Dorothea is sobbing on her honeymoon. Now this is a very famous passage, but the first part doesn't get us quite as much attention as I think it could. Not that this inward amazement of Dorothea's was anything very exceptional. Many souls in their young nudity are tumbled out among incongruities and left to find their feet among them while their elders go about their business. Nor can I suppose that when Mrs. Casaubon is discovered in a fit of weeping 6 weeks after her wedding, the situation will be regarded as tragic. Some discouragement, some faintness of heart at the new real future which replaces the imaginary is not unusual, and we do not expect people to be deeply moved by what is not unusual. That element of tragedy which lies in the very fact of frequency has not yet wrought itself into the coarse emotion of mankind, and perhaps our frames could hardly bear much of it. If we had a keen vision and feeling of all ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heartbeat, and we should die of that roar which lies on the other side of silence. As it is, the quickest of us walk about well wadded with stupidity. So as in Dickens, we have a kind of proliferation of habit, not just one kind of ordinariness, but multiple ones. So Dorothy is surprised, but her surprise is figured for us specifically as not exceptional. So paradoxically, it's ordinary surprise. This is what happens to people. They get surprised on their honeymoons. So her unhappiness is actually of such a routine kind that her elders can afford to ignore it. And so they go about their business. So they have their routines that they're following. Meanwhile, we readers too are stupefied by habit. We're so well wadded by our perceptual routines that we don't see a common kind of unhappiness as tragic. Maybe in time, the narrator suggests we might develop new habits of perception. In the meanwhile, the realist novel has to develop aesthetic strategies that convey ordinary unhappiness as both ordinary and shocking. I think Eliot is using in some ways the kind of totally different strategies from Dickens, maybe even the opposite. So instead of pounding us over the head with words like common and homely, she imagines the coming of new habits in elaborate syntactical formations and heaping negatives, as in the sentence, "We do not expect people to be deeply moved by what is not unusual." That's a triple negative, and therefore hard to follow. So in positive terms, we expect people to be moved by exceptional things, not by ordinary ones. If Dickens uses verbal repetition to draw us into new habits, Eliot forecasts the coming of new habits in sentences that are hard to follow because we have to delay and double back to make our way through her negations to figure out exactly what she's undoing. In a way, this makes a certain kind of sense. By her logic, our progress toward the future is going to depend on negating our negations, our habit of ignoring common pain. We're going to have to cancel out our canceling out. So in my own recent work, I've been really interested in the fact that contemporary television and also fiction pick up on this same realist challenge in their own intriguing ways. And I've written about what I call the shock of the banal in Mad Men and The Wire. But I've also been thinking about poetry and the ways that the formal challenge seems very different to me in poetry than in prose. Equally interesting, and in so many ways more poetry affords more thinking directly about repetition. It's much easier to think repetition in poetic form, especially if you think about narratives needing to be focused on crises and conflicts. Poetry can dwell in and with repetition. So the final overarching claim I want to make here before I get to the reading of the poem is that there are certain thoughts about the repetitive character of political and economic power that poetry is particularly adept at helping us to understand. Rhythm and rhyme train us into routines. They build expectations of recurrence. In this, they're like social worlds. They set up normalizing patterns. And in particular, it's multiple modes of repetition that intersect and overlap in a poetic text. I mentioned this morning in the seminar. Rhythm and rhyme are two different but overlaid patterns of repetition that are working at the same time. And that's led me to think about poetry as helping us to do the kind of political theorizing that I associate most closely with intersectional analysis, where we focus on multiple structurings of power that are operating together but not exactly the same way. So rhyme and meter, like class and race, are both overlapping and separate patterns of repetition. So by way of an example, I'd like to spend the rest of my time with John Clare's poem, The Harvest Morning, which is one that you should have in hand. I'm especially drawn to this work because Clare tries to persuade his readers, and if you know Clare, you'll know he's the peasant poet. He identified very closely and was an agricultural worker, but not with regular earnings, living a very marginal existence. He tries to persuade his readers to place a higher value than they're used to on ordinary work and routine repetitive labor. But at the same time, Clare is also really interested in the painful hierarchies that perpetuate poverty. And it's a poem very interested in exchange, though it also offers a very scathing critique of conventional economics. So I want to suggest that Clare, and I'll take you through these kind of one by one, but that he's interweaving 4 different kinds of repetitions, all of which are extremely interesting to me, and I hope will be interesting to you too. He addresses routines of labor, which, as I've said, are hard for the novel to represent. He's interested in patterns of exchange. He's interested in hierarchies and repetitive habits of class hierarchy. And he thinks all of these through poetic repetitions. And I'm going to focus particularly on rhyme and meter. So these are these multiple kinds of repetition that are overlaid in this poem. So what I want to do is to start by walking through Clare's attention to labor and exchange, and then I'll talk about poetic form. I always have trouble doing this in an order that makes sense because in some sense the whole point is that they're overlaid, but I think we have to take them apart to be able to see how they then work on top of one another. The poem, first of all, focuses on a repetitive event, that is the harvest, which is the seasonal labor of bringing in the crops, something that was often pictured in visual art at the time. Clare populates the poem with a sequence of types of workers. So you can see, for example, the laboring rustic is in line 3 of the poem. These are types of worker. He then goes on to talk about the bird boy, the mower, the picker, the loading boy, all these different types. Each worker engages in repetitive labor. So we have mowing and sweeping and whirling and mauling in the poem. Then on the margins of the scene, we have crowds, chickens, hogs, geese, and a motley crowd of poor people. Only one character, and this is number 1 on the right side of your handout, Lovely Emma gets a name in the poem. And even she comes to stand for the generality of poverty itself a few lines later. So she's 5 lines down, she's, "Oh, poverty." So she goes from being a specific person to being a general fact or phenomenon quite quickly. So we're in a world of repetitions and generalities, the recurring time of the harvest, repetitive labor, and groups and types of people and animals. Now, the harvest isn't just a repetitive event, it's also a cyclical one, and it's got 2 cycles built in, as Claire theorizes it. That is, it's seasonal on the one hand, recurring every year, but it also involves a cycle of energy spent and energy consumed by the workers. So this is number 2 on your handout, lower left. You can either read it up here or down there. I wanted to give you the whole context of the poem. The loading boy revengeful inly grieves to find his unmatched strength and power decay. The barley horn his garments interweaves, smarting and sweating 'neath the sultry day. So this is the cycle of survival. To gather the crops to eat, the workers have to exhaust their own energy. So we see the loading boy getting tired. And then to keep going with the harvesting of food, they need to eat more. So we see refreshment must recruit exhausted power. That's passage number 3 on the right-hand side. So the harvest is a cycle of inputs and outputs. To gather the food, you have to deplete your energy. To bring up your energy again, you have to eat the food. And so you're in this kind of constant cycle of survival. But one of the things that Claire makes clear in this poem is that the inputs and the outputs are never even or symmetrical. So one example in the poem is the summer sun. On the one hand, the sun is necessary to the harvest, and it opens the action of the poem in the first place. The sunrise is what makes the harvest possible. But on the other hand, the sun also depletes the workers' energies in harvesting. And this is number 4, which is, again, back on the left-hand side in the second stanza. How drive the sun's warm beams the mist away, how labor sweats and toils and dreads the sultry day. The relations between labor and nourishment are also uneven. In stanza 3, the laborers pass around a bottle, and that increases their work, their toils pursuing with redoubled might. That's the stanza afterwards. Later, they pass around a bottle again, but instead of increasing their work this time, they stop to take their drink, and that ends their work, and it also ends the poem's action. So the first refreshment increases the work, and the second refreshment stops the work. So in a poem about cycles of survival, you can't ever tell how much is given and how much is taken. Producing and depleting are in this ongoing interrelation, sometimes literally happening at the same time, as we see with the summer sun, but never in quantities that you can really calculate. And in fact, the poem is really interested in excess, litter, and waste. The gleaner is particularly important here. The figure of the gleaner, as I'm sure many of you know, goes back to Leviticus, where farmers are commanded not to take in all of their harvest, but always to leave some behind for strangers and for the poor who can't work. This was a hotly contested right in 19th century Britain. As you can see here in this 1872 account, I'm going to just read you 2 little pieces from this book, The Beautiful Gleaner. The question whether the poor have a right to glean in England has often been raised and discussed. It was a solemn judgment in the Court of Common Pleas that no such right could be claimed at common law. Mr. Justice Gould dissented, quoting the passages in the Levitical law which bore on the subject, together with the recognition of the custom or privilege in the Private Enclosure Act of Basingstoke Parish. The other judges, however, were of opinion that it would be impolitic and dangerous to admit gleaning to be a right, and would in fact be prejudicial to the poor. So you can see you have actually multiple legal models in conflict over the figure of the gleaner. You have the Levitical law, and then you have the common law, and then you have enclosure, all competing for the question, over the question of gleaning. Clare falls firmly on the side of the gleaner's right. He tells you not to grudge the tiny amount that the gleaner will take from you. This is number 6 on your handout on the right-hand side on the top. You'll never miss it from your ample store. Letting the poor have the scraps, he adds, also means that you'll never be deprived yourself. And this is a couple of lines later. But he shall never lack that giveth to the poor. So in this line, you can see that even if you lose, you won't lose. You can't calculate the loss as loss. In these two lines that are not that far from each other, we actually have two different but both truly incalculable models of economy at work. The amount of food that reaches the gleaner is so small that it can't be calculated, and it's a loss that guarantees you against future losses. In a wonderful line in the last stanza, the poet imagines himself as like the gleaner, stealing odds and ends from the muses' harvest. Number 8 in the last stanza. Oh, could I soar me on the muse's wing, what rifled charms would my researches bring? So the poet, like the gleaner, wants to rifle from those who have so much like the muse that they won't miss it. Through the poem, then, Clare dwells on exchanges, labor and consumption, producing and depleting, but he keeps our attention again and again on asymmetry and incalculability. So this is a poem that keeps inviting us to think about repetitive cycles of giving and taking, but it keeps also insisting on uneven and indeterminate flows of inputs and outputs. So now what I want to do is to think about how rhyme and meter are especially effective forms for thinking these patternings of repetitive labor and uneven distribution. Clare uses the Spenserian stanza, which was very popular at the time. It was used, among many others, by Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, and Keats. And I want to talk a bit about the Spenserian rhyme scheme and then its metrical form, and think about how those might help us think about the labor and the economic models of the poem. The rhyme scheme follows the pattern A-B-A-B, B-C-B-C-C. It's 9 lines, so distinctly asymmetrical in its form, but it's also highly repetitive. You just get 3 rhyming sounds in all 9 lines, A, B, and C. Both B and C sounds return and then C in a final couplet, so it's actually as if the rhymes intensify, get closer as the stanza unfolds. There's also a structural ambivalence in the rhyme scheme. The stanza begins with what might seem like an opening quatrain, that usual alternating back and forth, A, B, A, B. But the 4th line can also feel closely linked to the 5th, as in a couplet, where you get those 2 B lines together. So the sonnet can either feel as though it starts with a quatrain, or its opening 5 lines can feel like a quintain, closing in line 5. And lots of scholars have pointed out that for the Spenserian stanza, this frequently creates a kind of dynamic or unpredictable relation among the stanza's parts. Now, what Clare does with this, I think, is really interesting. In this example, we get a nice period at the end of line 4. So we get a nice quatrain and then a new thought with the new quintain, with the 5th line. But that's not always what happens in the Harvest Morning. So let's look at the example of the 2nd stanza, where he enjambs the 4th and the 5th lines. The bird boy's pealing horn is loudly blowed. The wagons jostle on with rattling sound, and hogs and geese now throng the dusty road, grunting and gabbling in contention round the barley ears that litter on the ground. So you can see that the first lines function like a quintain. They really can't function like a quatrain because it's enjambed. So you just have to keep reading on to the 5th line. In the last stanza, Clare does the same thing again. He enjambs in stanza 10, O rural life, what charms thy meanest hide, what sweet descriptions bards disdain to sing, what loves, what graces on thy plains abide. Oh, could I soar me on the muse's wing, what rifled charms should my researches bring. The reason I point to this is that both of these quintains focus on acts of taking scraps from others. Clare steals the extra line just as he imagines himself rifling charms from the muse. So remember, the logic of the gleaner is that she takes what she's entitled to take and what she's not entitled to take at the same time. She works across 2 different economies, a moral and religious economy that says she has the right to the scraps, and a legal and economic system that forbids her those scraps. The Spenserian quintain thinks this doubleness in and through its form. The couplet is there for the taking, and that would seem to leave the next quintain a line short. And that seems like a kind of theft, except that both quatrains are still there, complete. So the form affords both property and theft, both having one's cake or one's scraps and eating them too. So the Spencerian stanza emerges, it seems to me, as a fitting form for thinking the complex figure of the gleaner, because it's intrinsically ambivalent about property and distribution. So we see how the rhyme scheme is well suited to thinking the excesses of the gift economy as well as the routines of labor and consumption. And now I want to think more quickly about meter. Spencerian stanzas 8 lines of iambic pentameter followed by a single Alexandrine, a long final 9th line. And this is number 11, the very last lines of your slide. So the closing lines, they actually rhyme, they're a couplet, but they're different lengths. So you might notice here that Claire's final couplet perfectly inverts wealth and poverty. Those beauties, wealth, which you in vain deride, beauties of richest bloom, superior to your pride. So the wealthy look down on the lowness of poverty, but the beauty of poverty is actually above them. So the poet reverses the usual hierarchy of wealth and beauty in lines that are themselves unequal, lines that promise equivalence in rhyme, but undermine it in meter. So what I want to do now is to come back to some of the questions posed by Dickens, Eliot, Shklovsky, and Scarry. Claire in this poem urges us to interrupt our habits of ignoring common life, and he asks us to see new beauty in the repetitive lives of ordinary work and workers, reversing that usual association between wealth and beauty and ugliness and poverty. And he does so something like Dickens by using repetition in language. But Claire is also doing something else, and something to my mind more fundamental, which is not just to try to focus aesthetic attention on the repetitive patterns of poverty and labor, but also to focus on the ongoing political facts of asymmetry and inequality. That is, not just what routines we're ignoring because they're beneath our notice, but the routines that produce our hierarchies of attention in the first place, the ones that invite us to admire wealth and ignore poverty, and those that produce the distinction between wealth and poverty at all. So Claire is interested in what I'm going to call the repetition of uneven distributions. And this is, for me, in place of specificity and structure, is the repetition of uneven distributions. We saw with Shklovsky that we were supposed to disrupt our repetitive routines of perceiving the world. With Dickens and Eliot, we had to disrupt our routines of ignoring routines. And now with Claire, we're grasping multiple overlaid routines that both generate the beauty of work and the entrenchments of inequality. He leads us away from static terms like structure and specificity, I think, and towards this patterning that I'm calling the repetition of uneven distribution. So, to my mind, this is a kind of theorizing that poetic form is better suited to do than other discursive forms. Rhyme and meter set up expectations of recurrence while accommodating unevenness, and they do so in overlapping, not always congruent ways. This heaping of repetition then gets us to the overlaid, intersecting experience of repetitive social patterns, labor, exchange, hierarchy, and poetry itself. Now, in some ways, this might feel like quite a traditional reading. I'm finding a coherence between the socioeconomic content of the poem and its form. But I want to suggest that it's a little different, too. Many critics today might argue that Claire's poetic form is responding to the specificities of his historical context. And I want to insist that that's not only what's going on, because both the literary and the social forms that he's referring to predate him and post-date him. They don't only belong to that moment. So think about Claire taking up the Spencerian stanza, for example. He's rifling a poetic tradition that long precedes him, and then he uses that stanza form to think through patterns of economics and inequality, some of which have lasted well after his own time and into ours, through these kind of painful repetitions that he's writing about. One crucial figure in the poem, the gleaner, reaches back more than 2 millennia and gets taken up again and again through the 19th century, as we can see in images like these, this famous one from Jean-François Millet. And here's a photograph from England in the 1870s. In the 1830s, the figure of the gleaner got borrowed for one of Jamaica's main newspapers, and it's still one of the main newspapers in the country today. And the news itself gets associated with gleaning little bits and pieces of information or knowledge. Today in the US, the Gleaners are also an organization that collects leftover food for homeless people. So what I want to do is to point to multiple layers of repetition, which are a little different from finding this congruence between repetition in the aesthetic and repetition in the social. Claire is deeply interested in the ways that social life is organized around repetitive activity, and he repeats the patterns of an old poetic form to suggest a new valuing of repetitive labor. Both artistic and economic forms, the harvest, the gleaner, the exchange of labor for wages, and the Spenserian stanza come before his time and outlast his time precisely by being repeated, by recurring. And even the figure of the exception, the poor stranger who must be allowed to take the scraps, reappears again and again as a challenge to other powerful and repetitive forms. So as a reader, I want to close by suggesting that poetic form might always open long and wide in this way. Both economic life and poetic form raise similar questions about arrangement and distribution. How are parts divided? What distributions will be repeated over time? What unevenness can we come to expect? And how should we understand what rightfully belongs? So rhyme and meter get us to new insights about politics and economics because they're actually made of the same kinds of repetitive patterns. So I want to suggest that poetic form offers ways for us now to theorize the ordinary repetitions that continue to shape life and labor in our own time. Digital humanists have developed visualizations that compress vast quantities of data into legible forms. These have been crucial for helping me and many others to think about tracking large-scale patterns that we can't see when we read in traditional ways. But I also worry that graphs and maps like these may actually re-entrench illusions of fixity and stasis, turning our attention again and again away from repetition. In this context, it's poetic form that seems to me perfectly poised to help us think repetitive but uneven relations between labor and consumption, between giving and taking, between the world's bounty and its starving poor. Thank you.
We have 10, 15 minutes for questions, so please.
So I'm thinking about your work with the Northern world literature, and I'm wondering, like, do you have to think about repetition differently in literature that's non-Western? And if so, how? And how is it, I mean, there's also a complication too when world literature is translated to English to be put into like a Norton anthology as well, right?
Yeah,
You can't
absolutely.
do
Yeah.
the same kind of close reading in an original language, right?
So I want to say yes and no to that question. And I think I welcome the argument because I think there's arguments on both sides to be said by it. But first of all, one of the things that rhyme affords across languages is memorization. And so lots of cultures have used rhyme for the purposes of memorization. So one of the things I'm interested in is what does travel or what does crop up across cultures. That's not necessarily all the rhymes are not all the same as each other, but they do allow cultures to pass on values or ideas or aesthetic objects through repetition. So rhyme is one of those repetitions that you can look at across cultures and see that it exists in lots of different ways across lots of different cultures. The harder question is how do you then represent that in an anthology or how do you teach that? One of the ways we tried to solve that problem in the more recent edition of the Norton is to talk about the form in our headnotes, even though the translation can't do justice to it. So for example, the ghazal, which is the Indian poet Ghalib's really famous form, but he also borrows that from Persia and from a long, long tradition. And then people like Adrian Rich and Gabriel Garcia Lorca pick it up, right? So it's actually a transnational form that travels, but it has this very complicated couplet structure that you can't produce in English and also reproduce his words, his meaning. So what we've done is to try to explain how it works in the original and then to suggest that the translation doesn't quite do it, but to think about how forms are working is, you know, it's not easy to teach poetry in translation, for sure.
So I love that you're looking at John Clare here and looking at her early poem. And I love the close reading. I keep having kind of historicist flashes here. I mean, on the one hand, if you're talking about repetition in this particular moment of John Clare, Richard's labor. And Clare himself in 1820 is being marketed very clearly as the next Robert Bloomfield. And so kind of there are whole layers of repetition surrounding this where, you know, the message itself isn't, I think just about any reader who picks this up is going to be seeing this as kind of yet another in a line of people who's being presented as the next Robert Bloomfield. So, I don't know, do we need to move back into the realm of historicism to
I guess the question I would love to hear you say more about is, so those are wonderful examples of repetition and really productive for thinking about how inescapable it is in a way, right? How do we process any new writer except in terms of ones that have gone before, and how do we think about any work of poetry except in the terms that we have received it? And to me, those are the big general questions. But why is it important to think about, how would you articulate why it's important to think about the repetitions of that particular moment for us?
Well, so when you're looking at the moves that Clare is making, they're already repetitive insofar as Bloomfield essentially has categorized these exact same scenes in the exact same context just 20 years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and there's another historicist level with these early Clare poems is the degree to which these things are just butchered in the editing process.
Yes.
Because it's 1820, it's a year after the Peterloo Massacre, and they do not want a radical peasant poet on their hands, and so you know, there's just so many levels of slipperiness here that it's tough to head into that kind of formalist sort of reading of just leaving the text by itself at some level. I'm not saying you necessarily did that.
No, but I do understand what you're saying, and I think here's what I would want to say in response. I have never cared and may never care where something starts. That is, I don't care which nation produced the first novel, or and then who borrows it, right, and follows it. Because to me, since we're all, you know, every word that comes out of my mouth has been used before me, right? Everything is being passed through me as repetition in a sense. It doesn't matter where it starts. And similarly with lots of forms, they can be invented in two different places. They don't belong to the place that got them first. So I have never been interested in that. But I do think it's one of the aspects of literary history that has been organizing our field for a really long time. That is, who's the first to produce this kind of stanza, or who breaks with this tradition or this convention. And it feels hard to shift the terms of our field so that we're not thinking in terms of breaks and ruptures and originality yet, or anymore. It means that Clare is an accident or a contingency for me. He doesn't have to be a great poet for me. He just has to think through these problems in ways that help us to think through the problems. And so poor Bloomfield, is that his name? I've never even heard of, I'm ashamed to say.
5 best-selling poems of the 19th century.
Wow, yeah. So speaking of repetition, right? And part of what I am interested in, like Moretti, is the way in which we've come back to this tiny number of texts over and over again and talked about cultures as though we understood cultures, when a culture couldn't possibly be known by 10 texts. It would have to be known through repetition. But how much is enough repetition? How many texts do you have to read before you can say that you know something about culture? And I feel like we don't have even the beginnings of an answer to that question in our field. We haven't actually asked that question. So it's a little bit of a dodge, but it doesn't matter to me whether it's first. It matters to me whether it's productive for us now. And that is a different question from the historicist one.
You just mentioned in passing at one point that you now teach, in your classes, you teach pattern recognition. Could you just say a little bit more about what that looks like? I mean, just because
Sure.
The way that you were just talking about it, teaching pattern recognition within the shape that a class gives you, within the kind of rhythm of a class, seems like a really hard thing to do, given the amount of stuff you have to get under your belt to recognize patterns. So how do you do that? What does it look like?
Right.
how
What's
things
that,
change.
I would love to talk more about that and also to solicit ideas from others about how they do that. So one of the things I've been doing is in the interest of trying to think about what stops students from feeling as though they can enter into literary analysis, right? They so often think there's some secret meaning or buried key and the smart person over there knows it and they don't know it, right? How to get to those students. Our first exercise in my classes recently has been to notice anything that repeats in a literary text. And it could be a single word, it could be an image, it could be an idea, it could be a punctuation mark. I had a student, not a particularly confident student, make an incredible point about semicolons in Jane Eyre, but on the first page, which, you know, as any of you who've read Charlotte Bronte know, she's a big fan of the semicolon, but I hadn't been paying much attention to it. And this student argued that that a semicolon connects but doesn't connect, right? It divides but doesn't completely divide. And so Jane's search for community is all in that semicolon, right? So this is what a student managed to point out. But what we were doing was first just noticing anything that repeated. And the student, the first thing that she noticed was semicolons all over the place. So then we talked about themes and we talked about different ideas in the novel and then tried to connect. So what we do is we try to connect one to the other. And then as we build a few texts, I do two things. I've asked students in my work and art class to take any given literary text and then to take 5 different texts that we've read in the class published within 5 years and to track any repetitions that they can find across those texts. So to think about what contextualization is as a kind of repetition also, right? To think about what's in this text that's also in this one, or what argument is being made here that's being made there. So the broadening happens partly through thinking about what contextualization is as a kind of tissue of repetitions. But then over time into thinking about genre. So I teach a course in detective fiction where we talk about, first of all, the detective is somebody who tracks patterns, right? That's what a detective does, trying to put them together into a story that makes sense. And the detective borrows from all these different disciplines, so from forensic science, from psychology, from textual analysis. And so we read the detective as a figure for being a student in the university and taking courses in lots of different fields. But then we look at the genre and the way that it changes over time and how each text both repeats things from the previous ones and shifts them and introduces new elements. So I try to think both across time and contextually to think about just anything that repeats. And I find that there are students for whom that's a big relief because they're just, anything counts. There's no wrong answer to what repeats. I mean, they, I suppose, could find something uninteresting, but I have yet to have a student, I mean, because I teach a whole course on pronouns also in literature where, like, I try to say to them, the least interesting words are the ones that are most interesting, in part because they repeat all over the place, you know. So the I, which we use 1,000 times a day, that's a really interesting word. And usually we're looking for the fancy words, you know, the symbolic ones, the really complicated and loaded ones. But one of the things we can do at the college level is just to think about how we use words to create worlds that are out of simple and repetitive patterns. So I haven't found it hard in the classroom to get students engaged, and now I've been working with high school teachers to try to use this method with their students, and they've been saying that it feels demystifying also, like that students feel more confidence.
A question about maybe how you'd see a current trend that I've noticed with Hollywood movies, which is to reboot and reset and to repackage essentially the same story and characters without it even being like something else.
Huh.
It's the newest Batman.
Right.
And there's a demand for one apparently every 4 or 5 years. I mean, not just something new in the saga, but the origin story. And it's sort of playing off what Nick had asked you earlier, and that is that there is this sense that there's something regressive about repetition. In Freud and the repetition compulsion, it becomes a pathology if we don't find some way to manage the symptoms of it. In culture, I think Adorno or Kramer that I mentioned earlier would see this kind of
Yeah.
culture because it's feeding or serving something in a way that's really quietist and accommodating to a status quo or dominant market system or whatever. So the question, I guess, is how does somebody simultaneously recognize their complete indebtedness, unconscious indebtedness to repetition and cycles on all fronts, and that, on the other hand, have some sort of awareness, revolutionary consciousness, emergence that gets you out of the cycle enough to reflect critically upon it and intervene?
Yeah, that's a really beautiful question. And I think there's kind of two moments in the story for me, and one is just recognizing the indebtedness, as you say, to repetition. I think that's very hard. I think it's much harder than it feels like. I tease one of my friends who's, I'll just say who it is because I think you guys will all know her, and then you'll see what the point of the story is. Jane Gallup, who was, you know, the bad girl of feminism for such a long time and always shocking and annoying people and getting under their skin. She has an absolutely ritualized, routinized day, right? That's how you produce revolutionary ideas. It's by getting up in the morning and writing, right? She has her clothes organized by color and by season, right? She does not want to spend time picking out her clothes, right? So to me, to think about the repetition, and Flaubert says something similar, right? You live like a bourgeois so that you can write like whatever it is. I'm not getting it exactly right, but you know, recognizing the repetitions that are productive for us, even productive of revolutionariness, is interesting to me because I think it would be too easy to say there's one on one hand and one completely on the other hand. The other question is, when we isolate the exceptional, I feel like I'm going to answer this in a kind of roundabout way. In pedagogy, when we isolate the exceptional, when we ask our students to read 8 novels, and they're all novels we've chosen that are great, right? Maybe they're the, you know, my favorite 19th century novels, and they don't see the other schlock that was produced in the 19th century, they have no idea. These are coming out of nowhere for them often. There's no context for that in terms of what's repeating and what's not. So I say to them, this novel was innovative. It brought in this whole new model. But what I'm actually doing is assuming a backdrop of repetition against which this novel emerges as special. And I think by moving always to the exceptional or the revolutionary, we miss the ways in which the two are always in dialogue with each other, that you can't have the revolutionary without the routine or the mundane. So the question would be, you know, I don't want to lose our interest in the exceptional, but have we just moved so far in one direction that we can't see the other as much as we could? And what would it mean to put that back in our kind of sights as something we self-consciously embrace? And that's the hard part, I guess, for me to persuade myself and others of.
Last question, Matt, yeah.
So I was thinking, you know, I keep thinking as you were talking about repetition, or this sort of denigration of repetition being characteristic, is how, like in early modern culture, this would have been unproblematic. And then I kept thinking about fashion, where repetition and difference sort of work together, repetition and innovation work together, you know, in ways that are, you know, entirely evident, not just in sort of the sort of recurrence of older styles, but even just in the cuts and forms and how things can be mixed up and renovated. So maybe my question is, how sort of specific to, say, literary study and to the academy right now are the questions you're asking? And do you think that sort of just pushing people to think about things like fashion does quite a bit?
Yeah, sure, I absolutely do, right. So the point is a great one, and I think the patternings are similarly repetitive and having only a certain amount of space to go, right? There's only so much you could do with fashion with the body that you're putting the fashion on. The form of the body is only going to afford a certain number of possible things to put on it. And so it is very similar. And I think we could start, I mean, I'm drawn, those of you who've read my book will know this, to structuralism and its movements across these different domains, instead of saying, you know, the literary is very special. Clearly, I'm better able to analyze it because I have a training in it. But to think about fashion might be a perfect way to get some students who think that this is not of interest to them interested, and to think about the limits on how much newness there is, I think might be terrifying to some. I certainly have a number of students who think that they're going to be the next, I don't even know the names of the famous fashion designers, but they think they're going to be the next ones. So thanks.
This is a great talk that Caroline gave. Lots of hooks in it to sort of grab onto and ask great questions. I hope then you'll stay and ask these questions in the reception right across the hallway. But first, please remain thanking Caroline Levine.